Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. And I did want to say thank you to all our speakers as well tonight, our panel discussants. There are 7 of us tonight who agreed to read the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo and discuss it, openly in our Facebook group, so that so that we could learn, but so that everybody could learn as well. And, you know, obviously, there's like a few different reasons for why we're doing this. This month, at least this past month, has been rife with things on the news, you know, focused on the Black Lives Matter movement because of the recent police brutality, and just there's been more of a spotlight on it, and because of that people have been focused on it more, and so they've been focused on it in real life, and they've been focused on it in Facebook, and that includes in our group, Psychiatry Network. There's been some discussions about it that have been difficult, but also eye-opening, and I think helpful to just to know what's in people's minds, and also like to spur some action and some change within the group itself. And so I'll just let you guys know that the way that we decided on doing this specific topic, you know, on this book was not because it was my idea. I had wanted to do something, and I reached out to Dr. Danielle Hairston, who I actually didn't know in real life, but know from like academics and from Facebook. And as I've been paying attention for the last couple of weeks, she's everywhere. So she's been a very vocal and active physician on this topic, which has been amazing. So I see that she's already been doing so much work, and so I'm so thankful that she wasn't like, I'm done, I'm doing so much already, like I can't. So she was willing to help me with this as well. And so my thought was, why don't we just have a panel discussion on racism in medicine, with Black psychiatrists sharing some of their stories, just so that other people can learn and understand from that. And she reached out to a few people that she knew who, you know, might be interested, and everybody kind of emphatically said no. And the reason that they said no was because they felt that something, and actually gave the suggestion of doing this book club instead as an alternative, because reading this book would be more, would be something where people are able to learn more on their own, rather than just kind of like passively being taught by people who are affected by racism. And so that's where the idea came from. And I have to be honest, I like really, and it's so for the last couple of weeks, I've been reading through the book, and I've been just talking to different people and just trying to get as much information as I can to learn. And like, I have to be honest that I like really have not, first of all, I'm gonna say I thought that I was not gonna learn that much from this book. I've heard of the book. I know it's been out for a couple of years, but I also felt like, oh, you know, I'm like pretty like with it. Like I follow like some progressive Facebook groups on some progressive physician groups on Facebook that I read, and like I care about these things, and so, but that wasn't the case. So I read this book, and it's like very, very eye-opening in a lot of ways, which we'll get to. But that was one thing. The other thing is, I feel like I really haven't done anything personally for this issue at all. Like, there's a lot of issues, like social issues, that I feel very strongly about and I do a lot for, and this just has never been one. And I kind of like, now it's like, it's, you know, going forward, it'll be important to me to address this like much more head on. But it's interesting, like the book. So this is the book. I have it here with me. I think if nothing else from tonight, personally, like what, and we'll each say what we want everyone to get out of this, but what I want everyone to get out of this is to understand that racism is more than what we actually think it is, and that we contribute to it individually. I mean, you know, it's a systemic issue, but individually we still contribute to it more than we actually think that we may. Even if you're a person who is, like, you consider yourself anti-racist, like, we just don't. So that was at least like one of the big things that I appreciated from this, and I really hope that this allows people in the group, like maybe if you go and read this book, like I'll be happy. Or if you start thinking about this issue or start talking about racism more, I'll be happy. And so with that, like, I don't want to talk too much. I just kind of wanted to give an introduction. I think this is important for us to do. It's being done like very purposefully. So yeah, we'll go from there. We have 6 other everybody here is a psychiatrist. Everyone is in the group. I wanted everyone to please like introduce yourself briefly, both your professional introduction as well as an introduction related to, you know, what brings you to this topic and to this moment, and we'll go from there. How about let's start, I'm gonna go just in order in the circle of people I see. Why don't we start with Dr. Alisa Gutman first.
Okay. Hi, Christina.
Hi.
So I'm Alisa Gutman. I'm in Philadelphia. I'm on the clinical faculty at University of Pennsylvania, and here in the city, I founded and I run a human rights clinic called Philadelphia Human Rights Clinic. We do asylum evaluations and teach medical students at all 5 of our area medical schools how to work with asylum seekers and be socially active and responsible physicians. Christina's making words because there's something else I'm supposed to say.
Yeah, if you could just share like where you are in this journey, like just in terms of like what your understanding and learning about racism in general has been up until this point, that would be great.
Sure. So it's hard to be in the hotspot of being the first one to talk about that, but here I am. So one of the reasons that I agreed to be part of the panel tonight is to work on being anti-racist. And I think that so I have my copy, which is like all tabbed and bookmarked. And I think one of the, so where am I at? I'm sure I'm at the beginning. I'm in a zone where I think one of the most important things for me in the book is the concept of white racial innocence. Even grappling with identity is something that I struggle with, and I talk to Christina about. I have a hard time even with the concept of whiteness, and the fact that I get to think about whether I'm white or not is an inherent reflection of being white and never having had to think about this, which is something that my Black colleagues didn't get to do. And I can, if it comes up later, I can explain why that's a question and a challenge for me. But I'm at the beginning, I think, like anyone who's open and honest would admit to being. I've believed myself to be an ally, and I think that events, not just in this past month, so I'm not, suddenly woke because Mr. George Floyd was murdered, but I think events over the past several years, I get to be surprised at the events that have occurred with our current president because I'm white. I got to be shocked by this, and it put me in a position to think, wow, this country is so much more racist than I really thought it was. And having to face that, knowing that none of my Black friends or colleagues were at all surprised, it was a clear reflection of how early I am in this process, that I really got to bury my head in the sand for 40 years of life before Trump took office. And it didn't matter to me. I didn't have to be bothered by it. I think this has really put it in all of our faces. I think to ignore it now is unconscionable, particularly as a physician and a psychiatrist. So I'm at the beginning, but a few years in, I'd say starting with our current president taking office and seeing the kinds of things that have happened since.
Thank you for sharing. And then next we have Dr. Allison Cotton. If you could just introduce
Hello.
yourself.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on this panel. I am relatively early career, I think, on this panel. I am a clinical faculty at the University of Nevada, Reno, child psychiatrist by training. I'm the clerkship director, so I'm working with medical students, and I also am heavily involved in education for residents and fellows. And my career, my professional interests lie in medical education, and also I've always been a strong advocate for women, and now for children, especially children who have mental health problems. And so the reason I am here tonight is because I think I'm still at the end of what was before what is to come for me. I grew up in a very sheltered way. I have enjoyed privilege my entire life without even really understanding it. I didn't really even understand the concept of racism until I read this book. And so I am in the process, and have been for about the last month, of sort of undoing all of the things that I've learned, and getting comfortable with the fact that I need to unlearn these things and relearn a new perspective, and not just say I'm a good person, I'm not racist, but also to be an actively anti-racist person. And this book, I think, was written for me. It spoke to me every page. I felt like there was something that I needed to underline and highlight and take notes. And so reading this book was surprising in that I didn't think I was racist. I still don't think that I'm racist.
To be a part of this panel. This was in no way a part of my plans for the weekend. Christina had asked me to participate on Friday night, and I said, goodness, this isn't something that's in my wheelhouse. It's something I've had the privilege of not having to think about a lot other than my long-held beliefs. And it's a book that's been on my Kindle since it came out in 2018, and since Friday night, it was the encouragement, it was the push I needed to read the book, to listen to several of the author, Dr. DiAngelo's talks online, which are excellent if anybody's looking to connect a bit more. And it's just been incredibly eye-opening, incredibly sobering. And like Allison, I thought, hey, this is potentially going to be an uncomfortable hour and a half, but it's a discomfort that needs to happen, and it's discomfort that I need to engage in more. Because I think that that's the way to so much of this book, so much of my biggest takeaway from it is that, and we even within our chat within this group, I need to distinguish between we as people who are participating in the group and white people. White people need to be able to engage in a dialogue more about racism without being reactive or uncomfortable about it. And that takes practice. It takes a lot of humility. And speaking of humility, I didn't mention, I'll mention just briefly, I went out of order with Christina's recommended intros, but I'm a psychiatrist in California. I work in big public health systems with some administrative tasks there. I work in medical education. And my favorite takeaways from Psychiatry Network and talks like this are certainly about how I can be a psychiatrist, but also how hopefully I can be a better human. So I'm excited to see what we all learn together tonight.
Thank you. How about Dr. Jessica Isom? I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Is it Isom?
Yeah,
or Isom?
it's Isom. Yeah.
Isom. Okay.
So first question, I'm also early career. I graduated residency last year, and I'm a community psychiatrist in Dorchester, Massachusetts, at a federally qualified health center. I also do still do medical education work at my residency at Yale, particularly around social justice and health equity, and more specifically focus on developing introspection as psychiatrists to better tackle things like structural racism and the way that we practice and interact with our patients. My introduction to white fragility came from a book club in another Facebook group. I think it was actually in 2018 that we did the book club, or maybe it was last year. And the topic of whiteness, like white culture and understanding that, is more of a required competency for being a Black person or a racialized minority in general in America. So it's not something novel for me. But the White Fragility book was like a more of a illuminating experience to a certain extent about some of the more aggressive interactions in spaces that I hadn't quite been able to put language to. So for me, it's been more of an empowering thing as far as labeling some of these maneuvers and behaviors and then not tolerating them as much anymore. And participating in the Facebook group, it was with women physicians, was also nice to actually co-host with other physicians. Usually it was a Black physician and a white physician, and just hear open, honest, transparent accounting of their childhood experiences, their adolescence, their socialization into becoming a physician, because it's quite different from mine. So that was enlightening as well. So I see white fragility as like an sort of stepping stone to having the kind of conversations that we need to have. For me to feel comfortable sending my family to see a psychiatrist, for my daughter to see a child and adolescent psychiatrist, for my family, my friends, to actually be treated as whole human beings when they encounter with people who are physicians. So that's kind of my hope for what happens after this.
Thank you. How about next we have Dr. Danielle Hairston.
Oh, I was thinking I was going to be last. Okay. So I am Dr. Danielle Hairston, Danny Hairston, a doc named Danny, all of those things. That's all of me on social media. I am the content creator behind Black Psychiatry. If you follow that on Twitter or Instagram, that's me usually doing things like that with another Danny out there. So I am a CL psychiatrist at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and I'm also an ECP, but I happen to be a very young and new program director, even though I just finished residency pretty recently. I'm a young boss, and I'm the president of the APA's Black Caucus. So that's why you might have seen me or heard me or somewhere that I was there. I know people feel a way about the APA sometimes, but I was on the town hall last week talking about racism and structural racism. I've recently written some things on social media about how not to be racist and how to be an ally, and how all racism isn't the overt things that you've been believing, as I think Alisa and maybe Allison also mentioned, that, oh, I'm not racist because I don't use the N-word or call people names, but how you are also complicit and can be complicit in racism, especially in medicine and psychiatry. So I am a co-author of the book as well, Racism and Psychiatry, that came out in 2019. And I think that's really when I started looking at the White Fragility book. And I tell really anyone, especially white people, to read the White Fragility book. And I have been for the last couple of years. But when we wrote that book, when I was coming on finishing my section of the book about racism in psychiatry and assessment and diagnosing, especially the overdiagnosis of schizophrenia in Black men, and it becoming a Black disease of agitation and aggression, I felt like White Fragility helped me to get some specific points to really make this a little bit more palatable. Because if it's a white woman who's spreading this information, as Jessica said before, sometimes people are more willing to accept that than it coming from a person of color, specifically a Black person. So I have a specific favorite chapter in this book, and that's probably the only thing I'm going to really talk about. When Christina asked me to do this, initially I was like, I don't think Black people want to talk about their trauma and their experiences with racism. They just don't. And then I asked in the Black psychiatry group, and they let me know that no, they don't. And they felt like their white colleagues or now non-people of color colleagues need to do the work. So this was homework and work that this was an ask from the group, and everyone that I asked was like, no, and no, and no. And there are specific reasons why, based on some of the history of some of the comments in Psychiatry Network. And I do follow Psychiatry Network. However, usually I'm not going to look at it too much in someone else unless someone's telling me to come and look here, like come and check this out, or here's a topic, or I want to ask a question, or I want to look up something about benzos and I Google it, or some CL topic, because there is a history in the group of some racist comments, including recently a racist comment saying, does systemic racism even exist? And if you don't think systemic racism exists and use terms like, oh, I'm colorblind, I'm worried about, and I think you're doing a disservice to your patients. So I'm here in the background. I'll tell you about my favorite chapter and the most, really what I think is the most effective chapter. And I'll hand it over to Mona.
All right. First of all, thanks so much everyone here for even having me a part of this discussion. Thanks, Christina, and all my wonderful colleagues here, and all of you guys watching, my respected colleagues. My name is Mona Masood. I'm also a psychiatrist, as everyone else on this panel. I'm also a general adult outpatient psychiatrist in the Philly area as well. And but I'm also the founder and chief organizer of Physician Support Line, and Dr. Cotton here is also one of the admin for Physician Support Line as well. And so that is one of my major things, but I'm also part of a nonprofit organization called Muslim Wellness Foundation here in Philly, which is an organization that centers mental health education for Muslim Americans, specifically to destigmatize mental health within our communities. And in Philly, we have a very large Black Muslim population. I think it is the largest in the entire nation. And so when we were talking about, for me personally, when we're talking about Muslim mental health, that is what we're talking about predominantly in my area. And so we host events such as the Black Muslim Psychology Conference, as well as the Deeply Rooted Emerging Leaders Fellowship that is specifically for emerging leaders within the Black college community and historically Black college community. And the reason I am here is to actually also kind of more in the background. I know this is a topic on white fragility, but people of color that are not Black have a lot of similar issues as what was mentioned in the book as well. And I do a lot of discussions within our non-Black Muslim communities on the model minority myth, and as well as just anti-Black racism within immigrant communities. And though that is a bit of a separate topic, it does have a lot of issues within the physician community, especially because the model minority myth has allowed a lot of immigrant communities to kind of work off the backs of our Black community in order to become physicians and different kind of social status. And it was off of climbing off the civil rights movement, as well as the hard work from the Black community. So I'm here in reference to that kind of discussion, as well as because I noticed, and I asked Christina if I could participate in this kind of specific role because of the recent comments on Psychiatry Network were noticeably from people who would identify as people of color, thinking that would somehow save them from having anti-Black racism. So That's me in a nutshell. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Mona, and thank you everybody for your comments and your presence. So what I did in order to we're already like halfway into the first hour, but so I wrote a number of questions, and I really, I think it's unlikely that we'll get through all the questions, and that's okay. But I as I'm going through, I'm like, oh, maybe I can skip through some questions, but I'm just going to start going through like the beginning, because like the first question came from the introduction. And this just stood out to me, this sentence that the author made, or the statement that she made was, she said that white progressives do the most daily damage to people of color. And that statement really stood out to me, because it's something like, I was like, at first I was like, wait, what? And then as I thought about it, I was like, oh, like that makes a lot of sense to me. But I really would love to hear what everybody's thoughts are on that particular statement from anybody who would like to speak. I can keep talking, but any thoughts on that? So again, it was the term was white progressives doing the most daily damage to people of color. So just, I think on its face, it sounds like kind of a, like it doesn't make sense, right? But does anybody have any experience with that actually happening, or have any other thoughts about it?
I'll talk. This is anxiety provoking.
Don't be anxious.
The way I interpret that for myself is that the idea that I have held all my life is that I am an ally. And so that gives me sort of liberty to talk about things freely, because I know in my heart that I'm an ally, I'm not racist. But what I have not understood is that some of the things that I say and do, those microaggressions, which is a word I've learned not too long ago, those little things that, because I think of myself as an ally, I feel that I'm able to do and say, I feel like that does harm. And I learned that not too long ago in another Facebook group where I made a comment assuming that I would be given the benefit of the doubt because I'm in that group. It's a Black Lives Matter group, and I made a comment trying to be concise, and it was just received so wrong. And I've been thinking a lot about intent versus impact. And I think Danny made a comment about this earlier too, is that the intent is fine, it's good, but the impact is not, and the impact is what matters. So that is something that we have to understand and anticipate the impact as best we can versus just focusing on ourselves and our intent. Best of intentions don't get you very far in these cases.
I'll jump in. I think, so what that statement means to me, and I think it's been part of, as I said, the beginning of the journey I've been going on in the last 3 years, is that it's so absolutely that white progressives are the problem. I was certainly part of the problem. I am part of the problem. And I think that's because of this notion of what Allison's saying, like believing I was already an ally. So when I said, earlier I struggle with the concept of whiteness, right? I get to think about the concept of whiteness. And if that's part of me, I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. She was a refugee to Philadelphia at 7. I was raised with that in the house, clearly, and raised with a whole lot of trauma in the house. So and I've, I'm like, I founded a human rights clinic, right? Like at some point you feel like I'm doing the work, I'm an ally. And, as I was saying before, I think it's the, for me, the slap in the face of seeing all the racism that, for me, I got to watch come out of the woodwork. Whereas anytime I've had this conversation in the last several years with any Black colleagues, any Black friends, they're like, oh, that's cute. You were surprised. That's so sweet. So being part of the problem, the reason that white progressives are the problem is thinking that we're done, we've done the work. And as it comes to anti-racism, I hadn't started the work. None of my credentialing that seemed perfectly fine to me and seemed reasonable and consistent with my understanding what being an ally would be is relevant to the system of racism, and that no matter who I think I am or how I want to identify myself, I sure look white and I sure look white. And so gaining an awareness of what that's meant every day of my life and how that reflects. So being in that position as what I believe to be a progressive a progressive white person who thought that I was already in and already working and not doing it, that's the insidious problem here, because that's what enables the systemic racism to continue, which is us all pretending like it's not even there. Like I got to pretend for years of life, decades of life, like, oh no, things seem fine. And that's unacceptable. And it's unfortunate that it's only been in the last several years that I had to wake up to that. It's shameful. And that's where this book is helpful, I think, in framing how that shame happens when we talk, Christina, and some of the questions you've raised and the other panelists have already talked about of having these conversations. The hard part of these conversations is all the shame of having been complicit for a lifetime. And how do you face that? It's easier just to not be part of this. Allison, I totally wanted to bail on this. And that's not okay. So here I am past my bedtime with a migraine and trying to have a conversation.
Absolutely. And we actually have a couple of comments from people watching the videos. One person said, I would imagine white progressives seem like allies till we let out Black colleagues, patients, friends down whenever we have microaggressions. We want to be trusted, but repeatedly show that we do not deserve that trust yet. Somebody else said, white progressives might tend to hold the belief that they are not racist and are therefore neutral, colorblind, etc., rather than actively being anti-racist. That's a great point. And then somebody else said, every white person benefits from racism. No way around that. So yeah, those are all great points. Did anybody else have anything to share before we go to the next question? No? Okay. The second question that, kind of the second topic was actually something that I thought was, at first I was like, this is too basic, right? So what is the definition of a racist? And the author notes that mainstream definition of racism is a person who consciously dislikes other people because of their race. And she talks about, wanting to define racism in a more nuanced manner. And this actually came up in my real life yesterday where I don't know if you guys know who JoJo Siwa is. She's a teeny bopper on YouTube that my 5-year-old, 6-year-old niece is really into. And there was an article today or yesterday about her having, one of her videos had a kid in blackface dancing. And I sent that video or sent the article to my family because like their daughter really likes this girl, and one of the people who got the article was like actually like said that exact same thing, said, well, I consider racism more when somebody doesn't like someone of another race. Like this seems more of like stereotyping behavior. And like, that's how they differentiated it. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is like, oh, this is still like a thing that needs to be addressed. So, and then we actually did have a conversation about it, which was good. But like, what do you guys think about that? And how, you know, how do you define or think we should be defining racism for people?
I can speak to this one, Christina, and I think it's, for me, looking at this book and looking at DiAngelo's definition, really, I think it's an eye-opener. And in some ways, I feel strongly that it is an eye-opener, in that, you know, when I'm talking even with my son about racism, it's very individual focused. It's about a person being a racist, and the versions that we see in the news and the people acting and misbehaving. We see, okay, you know, that's what racism looks like. But as we take a step back and we look at certainly this book, at White Fragility, if we look at 13th, if we look at Just Mercy, all these examples that we have even available to us now, if not just right outside our front door, we realize that it's a system, it's a structure, it's more pervasive. It's something that certainly individual opinions can be a part of it, and individual expressions. But it's really about how white people, about the systems that we're in, whether it's medicine, whether it's psychiatry, whether those historically and presently are silent beneficiaries of that system. And one of the points that DiAngelo makes is a person, as an individual, can be a good person, so to speak. They can have good behaviors, how we gauge that with ethics, and still be racist. Or a person can be a bad person and not be racist. And it's really taking that onus off of the individual, but taking a closer look at everything with our interactions, and really trying to look for racism in our many blind spots beyond just what we say and do.
Yeah, I have a hard time a little bit with the author, like trying to, I mean, I guess, I suppose I understand that, you know, the concept of systemic racism and how that affects people like on a subconscious level, but and I suppose it's because there's like such a gradation, right? So there's still like this big chunk in the middle to me where I do think it's still individuals maybe having been influenced over time, you know, systemically, but I have a hard time like taking away or not putting so much blame or so much like anger or vitriol towards some of these things where I feel like there should maybe be some accountability. I don't know.
So I'll say that, even though I said I wasn't going to really talk too much, but this is kind of what's comment the chapter that I like. So obviously, when we say systemic, like the system isn't some tangible thing, like, oh, it's the system.
Right.
Like system is made up of individuals, like the individuals and their reactions and their behaviors are what contribute to what is the system. So it is both individual and on a systemic level. So racism is not a monolith. Racism is etched into every single part of life, and it's not just the US, across the world. So that's why I guess this is again what I was saying on the APA town hall and things that I write all the time. Racism is not just saying that someone is the N-word. Oh, like that's racist. Okay, we can all say that's racist, right? Like, oh, nope, I don't do that, so I'm not racist. But racism is also, or benefits of racism are not having to think about racism. Like whether you call that white privilege or whatever, you can turn that off. Like at the end of the day, you can go home and not worry about this. Like everyone, the majority of people on this call, on this live, can go home or be at home and not think about being Black or not think about racism. But Jessica and I can't do that. Like we're Black, all day, every day. When you go into work, you have to think about, well, will someone make a comment about me being a Black doctor? Do I have to think about being pulled over? What's going on with my family? Like, that is a part of the racist system that we live in and that many benefit from. When racist things are like housing, like who can get a mortgage, where your education funds come from because of taxes. When you see the discrepancy in sentencing between powder cocaine and crack cocaine. When you see someone who when you sit on these panels and national organizations for residency recruitment, and they say, oh, well, that person just isn't the right fit, or they came from a lesser school because it's a HBCU, but a HBCU produces more Black top physicians and researchers than any other institutions in this country. So when you're saying like, I don't think that I'm racist, or I'm not racist, that's again back to how white progressives are dangerous in this system, because you're centering it on yourself. And you're saying, I don't do these things, I'm not racist, and you're taking away from when the Black people or the other people of color are explaining to you their situations, and then you move the conversation and shift the conversation to yourself and how you feel. So that's how progressives can be dangerous. That's how people are not understanding that the system is really a whole, and that we're all in this system. Like even Black people and Black psychiatrists are victims of white supremacy, and seeing that a white institution is better. That's even the same for a student who will say, oh, I want to go to Harvard versus I'll never apply to Howard. Because in a system of white supremacy, it's Black versus white, and it's good versus good versus bad. So that's my 2 cents on that. Like, there is an in between. It goes just like racism is all the way from someone calling me the N-word when I'm in college versus someone in fellowship or training saying that, oh, Danielle is lazy or she's inefficient, but I do the same work as all of the other trainees and I happen to only be the Black one, but I'm inefficient and I'm lazy. Like, so there's a whole stretch of what racism is. And I think that what this book is really showing, and so my favorite chapter, if you didn't know, was chapter 6, anti-Blackness, because it's telling you examples step by step. You didn't think you were racist. This is what's racist. This is what's racist. This is what's racist. These are the numbers, because here's the data. That's another thing that people use to undermine Black experiences by saying, oh, where's the data? Or I don't think that's racist, or trying to gaslight people. Those are all a part of being racist.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's a lot more. That there's like, yeah, there's a lot more thought in that than what I was thinking. So thank you for sharing that.
Danny, I think that the good bad binary, so chapter 5 is what probably, so trying to be a white interpreter over here. So I think what happens for white folks is that the shame happens, right? So
yes.
I think it's the I had a good tab on this in one of my tabs. Let's see if I can find it. To put it bluntly, I believe that this is in your favorite chapter, Danny, in chapter 6. To put it bluntly, I believe that the white collective fundamentally hates Blackness for what it reminds us of, that we are capable and guilty of perpetrating immeasurable harm, and that our gains come through the subjugation of others. So even saying that, I almost white girl cry, even like really letting those words resonate, because shame, right? And I, as as a room full of psychiatrists, I imagine you've all had the same experience I have in working towards understanding human emotions, which is that shame is the worst one. It is just the worst one we have. And so when shame gets brought on, it's, and going back to that idea of good, bad binary. So feeling that shame, feeling bad, thinking that it has to be in this dichotomy. I can't be a person with nuance, with lots of shades of gray, where I get some things right and I get some things terribly wrong, and then feeling scared to be out in the open with that. So it's easier for white folks to pretend like none of this is really happening. And I think that's where you get some of the more absurd, like shocking, kind of disgusting comments, which is what we saw on Psychiatry Network a few weeks ago, which, you know, again, I get to be shocked by that. Like, what is this guy? This is a psychiatrist? Good Lord, what's happening right here? Don't you think about things? We're all supposed to think about stuff. We're supposed to help our patients with that, right? But it's right there. And so I think it's that like shame, defensiveness reaction, and then full projection. Nothing's here, nothing to see here.
So, I mean, just to kind of add on, Alisa, like, because we are speaking to all of our colleagues who are psychiatrists, and it's something that we often tell our own patients, and I know I definitely do in my outpatient work, is, you know, the concept of distress tolerance, right? And it's like, you know, we tell people, you know, when we have things like that are such dichotomous thinking that are so on either extremes, we outside of, you know, just we're not going to diagnosis of borderline, etc. But when we're just talking about how humans process information and emotion, we tend to challenge our patients to stay within like the gray zone and tolerate it. And that to find out that we're not going to be eliminated, we aren't annihilated if we just sit in the gray zone. We actually make more informed decisions. We actually are able to weigh pluses and minuses better when we're not so adamant on trying to just be good or bad. And these are things that I think we can apply for ourselves when it comes to something so incredibly at odds as who we are, because we're physicians, we do no harm, right? We have this as this kind of concept we tell ourselves. So if we're somehow failing, quote unquote, that's where the shame comes from. But if we can tell ourselves we are also growing because we're human beings, we're fallible, we're not just, you know, physicians, but we are humans treating humans, then we can humble ourselves to the point where we can do some real growth. At least that has been a part of my journey too.
No, I think that's a great point, because I think it's always hard to remember, like, to look for the, you know, when there's something that's negative, look for the positive or whatever, like just for yourself personally, so that you don't like fall apart because of how bad things are, or, you know, how terrible they feel. And I agree, like, I don't know, this good, bad binary, I really liked that concept too, just because it was so psychiatric, like being able to sit with like negative emotions, or also like, no, you know, feeling like, okay, I can have some good qualities and I can have some bad qualities, but it doesn't necessarily make me a bad person. So of course that means you need to be aware of what those qualities are and work on them. But yeah, so thanks for sharing. Any other thoughts on that idea? Anybody?
I would just add that I think another thing I've seen in lots of recent conversations in white spaces is white progressives attempt to articulate themselves what racism is, despite the wealth of already existing definitions out there. And I would say if someone's trying to figure out where to start with that, beyond just the introspection in White Fragility, there's an article by Dr. Kamara Jones. It's called Toward the Science and Practice of Anti-Racism, Launching a National Campaign Against Racism. One of my favorite questions from the article was, how is racism operating here? I think that question should be asked 1 million times during a white person's day. So when you wake up in your home, you could ask that question. What about the internal space in my home? What about my neighborhood? If you have children, when you send them off to school, daycare, when you go to the grocery store, when you access your place of employment, when you drive in your car, if you were to ask yourself that question, it could be a starting point for seeing where racism is basically swirling around you at every step of the way. And again, the article goes into great detail about sub-questions underneath that question to articulate where you can name racism, because for Dr. Jones, that's the first step to actually being anti-racist. So increasing your capacity for naming it despite all of the other things that we're talking about here, is the first step. And then from there, she sort of systematically breaks down what you, where you should go from there. And I would say in my experience, naming racism as a Black person, often my definition is not accepted, it's invalidated, it's dismissed. I'm being sensitive, dramatic, things of that nature. So I think it would be really helpful if a white person accessed the same definitions that I'm accessing that are legitimate and real, and started using those in their descriptions of what racism is. And White Fragility offers a definition, but there are lots of scholars out there who offer better ones. And Dr. Kamara Jones is one of those. So that would be my suggestion.
Okay, great. I will pull that up and add that to the list of resources too at the end. Thank you, Jessica. And so I guess we're touching on this a little bit already, but I'm still gonna pose this next question. How do people talk about racism in a coded way? And you know, we can talk about examples of that, or just whether we even hear about this a lot in our day-to-day experiences or work experiences. I'll just say, like, briefly for myself, I feel like I hear it a lot. And again, like, this is something that I feel like should not be coming as like a big, like, wow, this is like a revelation to me today, but it sort of was. I was like, oh my God, like, what, you know, all of the like example terms that the author was giving of like how we talk about it. I was like, I hear those a lot, and I hear those like both in my like regular life, but also at work, and when we're talking about recruiting and things like that. And that was like really difficult for me to see and think about, because I was like it's something that I would like to change, you know, but I was also just not happy that this was like not known to me prior till now, or like that I wasn't aware of it. But any thoughts that you guys have about this topic? I kind of feel like this is huge, because this is basically how white people, maybe like everybody really like talks about racism and talks about Black people. Like, no one uses the word racist like at work, or racism as a term in any way, like in a positive or in a negative way, like at all, unless you're talking about like, you know, the diversity committee that you're a part of and like need to do some work for it. Like, nobody talks about it. So, but we do talk about it all the time, right? So what do you guys think?
So one of the things that like blew my mind, and I had to read this over and over again when I was reading this book, is the anecdote that she gives, where the child and the mom are in the grocery store, the white child and the white mother, and the child says, "Look, mommy, that man has black skin." And the mom, what does she do? She shushes the child. So from a very young age, we are taught that certain topics are not to be said out loud. Certain things are not to be said out loud, and race is one of them. I think she gives the examples of obesity and physical disabilities as well. And then she goes on to say that if the child had said, "Look how handsome that man is, look how smart that man is," then the child is met with chuckles and that kind of thing. But when the child calls out something like that, the child is trained from birth to shush that, to keep it in, to hold it in. And so I think that trains us that racism is not a word we get to talk about. It's bad. It's taboo. We don't need to. Other people worry about that. And so that sort of ushers us into adolescence and adulthood, when we start to kind of just assimilate to this culture of using words like urban and things like that. So, I mean, I think it's woven into the DNA of who we are, to kind of shush it under the table and be afraid of it.
Well,
So
not just that, but like, I think like shushing, you know, a child saying like somebody's Black or their skin is Black, also like, you're implying to the child and teaching the child that being Black is a bad thing. Like, you know, in the same categories as like these other, you know, like being disabled or whatever may be. So that's a great point too.
Yeah.
Teaching your children and then also teaching our children as well. I have a 2.5-year-old who's she's in daycare now. Well, she was in daycare, but who will soon be entering into some kind of form of post-pandemic grade school. And we can do what we can in the home to teach her that her skin is beautiful, but then she meets your children. So just adding that part into the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder. Like and that should be like a very easy thing for people to do, right? Like on the list of asks. So yeah, any other thoughts from anybody on that?
I just wanted to mention, I guess, you know, with this topic on how we code our language, I think about some of the things that are just prevalent in the way that we learn history, even in our elections, all of these different buzzwords, if you will, ranging from historical concepts, the war on drugs, the war on poverty, being tough on crime, redlining, gerrymandering. Every one of these words, and in my opinion, after reading the book, I'm wondering, wow, are all of these synonyms or byproducts of racism? And if we just called them for what they were, would that change the way that people respond to them, especially our white progressives that we spoke about at the beginning? Because I think these issues they might all be the same topic.
It is all the same topic. Yeah.
I was going to say it's in our curriculum under the topic of racism in bold. So
I'd say my favorite veiled racism in the last several weeks has been, the protests. I believe in the protests, but the looting, that's the problem right now. And that's just been everywhere. And, you know, so shifting from allyhood to working towards anti-racism, every time I'm hearing that little dog whistle, I'm like, whoa, actually, no, that's not correct. And here's why the protests are important. Here's why they're overdue. Here's why we need to be paying attention. And here's why you're changing the subject isn't an okay thing to do right now.
Right. Or Alisa, even what would protests versus riots? I wouldn't even notice the way people were referring to them. Patients too, because Philly had some large ones here, and I'm talking to a patient and they're like, oh, I'm having anxiety today, and I'm like, oh, what about? And then they're like, oh, the riots. I'm like, oh, the riots. And I said, is there a reason you're saying riots? And so I think language is definitely there. And I think that based on Allison, what you were saying earlier about, you know, what it was said to children about race and what we're hearing and what children are hearing and what they're told not to hear. Like, I think you were saying racism, or like we can't talk about racism, but I think it was really, you can't talk about race, like race. And just as we know as kids too, and we can even remember, is when all of a sudden something becomes the forbidden word or the word not to say or not to do, it becomes the one we get hyper focused on internally. And so it's like, oh, you know, how come, oh, my kid heard me say, don't say the F word once, and now all of a sudden they're saying the F word. And instead of, I told them to say please a million times and they never say please. And so it becomes kind of like that too with kids. It's like, oh, wow, mom had a reaction there. How do I reproduce that reaction? Or what got her so riled up? It's something about what I said and what it means. And so kids are obviously learning a lot more than in what we're not saying versus what we are saying.
I think that was one of the things that, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jessica.
I was going to say, there's another book called Racial Healing. I think it's Grandmother's Hands, that talks a lot about racism being in the body. So not only are you transmitting the message, but the bodily reaction to the sight of a Black person, which is a lot of the racial anxiety that, you know, white people have is rooted in that learned body reaction that this is something that I should perceive as whatever adjective, threatening, alien, different, bad, things of that nature. So it's both intellectual transmission as well as a bodily transmission.
Thank you. And well, and we, I think a few of us have or a few of you guys have mentioned this term, but the term colorblind, right? So really, especially after the civil rights movement, I think people felt like everything's okay now. And so people really love to describe themselves as colorblind. So how is using the term colorblind harmful for moving things forward for Black people?
All right, I will have to take this one because this is one of my most hated terms. And if anyone happened to hear me on NPR on Thursday or Friday, this is what I was talking about, colorblind. And I actually recently had to do a hospital visit, like a site visit for the residents of a new site that I wanted to take them to. And I was actually worried about their acceptance. I have a very, very diverse residency program, and we have residents of all identities, racial, gender, sexual, whatever it is. And I was concerned about this location just based on my feelings about the location. So I went on the visit, I saw that it was actually diverse, and I was like, you know what, I think I can get into this. I think I might feel safe sending my residents here. And then one of the medical directors said, yes, we are very welcoming here. I am colorblind. I treat all of my patients the same. And I was like, you see what you just messed it up for yourself, sir. And then I had to let him have it, because by saying you're colorblind, that means you're missing an important part of your patient's experience. We are not without history. We are not an ahistorical people, period, in this country, but Black people are not without history. And to say that you are colorblind, you don't see color, you treat everyone the same, is actually disrespectful, and it's actually a disservice to your patients, and it's a disservice to your colleagues, and it's a disservice to who's ever training and education you may have been trusted with. Because if you can't understand that, for example, a medical student who is the sole Black person in their class or their hospital, what it's like for you to continually question their knowledge, question their education, but you say that, I'm colorblind, but this is something that you're doing because of your implicit bias. Or for you to say that, I don't see color when I see my patients, but you don't understand that your patients' family members might have been involved and impacted by the Tuskegee experiments, or they might be worried about their family member driving or walking or breathing or sitting or bird watching. And for you to say that you are colorblind is actually unacceptable. And then, he asked me, do I want to come talk for Grand Rounds? Let me say
That's great.
It's just unacceptable. I don't know. At this time, I don't know what I hate more. What about Black on Black crime, or are you colorblind? Like, it's I don't know. It's a tight race.
I think though that the term colorblind, I really feel, I feel like genuinely people believe to their heart that this is a good thing. So I think it's just they haven't been able to. I'm glad that his reaction to after talking to you is great, I want to hear more, please come talk with us. But a lot of people, I just feel like just don't even have an idea of this concept that exists, and how it may affect people.
So Christina, usually when people say I don't see color, and that's they're, like they were saying color celebration. I don't know. There was a piece in the book that said that colorblind and color celebrate or something like that. And usually when somebody says I don't see color, I'm like, well, you can change that. It's not you don't see color. It's you haven't had to care about color. You haven't had to care about race before, is what you're trying to tell me. Or that's at least what I'm hearing too. When people are like, I'm colorblind.
Yeah, that's a good way to reframe it, I think.
I think it's an example of people who are trying to be allies, but who are unintentionally being as dismissive as they can possibly be of the identity of Black culture and Black people and Black history and what that means and their experience in this world. It's a dismissal.
And part of that dismissal, I think Dr. DiAngelo in the book really argues, is it's not about the colors that we're not seeing, it's about our own comfort. It's about trying to say, hey, by being colorblind, this is something that's uncomfortable for me, and I don't have to acknowledge it, I don't have to think about it, because either it makes me uncomfortable or I fear it might make somebody else uncomfortable, and then I'll have to react to it. It'll have to, maybe I'll get asked to speak for grand rounds or something, I don't know. You know, it's, yeah, I'm glad we're talking about it.
I'll add in these colorblind spaces that essentially the impact for people that want to have conversations about race and racism, it inherently makes you the racist for bringing up color. I, in residency, had a pretty traumatizing experience where I mentioned race on an inpatient unit, and Lord knows the whole unit was set on fire. And it culminated in this aggressive, loud accusation that I was a racist for basically bringing up this. So again,
I race like about a patient or
about a patient encounter, and it wasn't even just me. There were other people that were talking about possible racialized treatment approaches with patients, like over medicating a person who was manic, for example, restrictive treatment plans in response to this manic patient. There were other conversations. There was a patient who yelled out the N-word, and we, you know, I was a chief resident at the time, had to respond to that particular incident. But apparently, quietly, the nurses and others were receiving those as accusations of racism, and felt that they were, I don't know, it became this like reverse racism kind of thing. So I think the colorblindness for me as a Black person represents a hostility towards having those conversations. It makes them dangerous. It makes me the potential recipient of other people's aggression and violence in different ways, including silencing, exclusionary practices in clinical settings, and then not even being able to talk about the things that we need to when there is a racialized treatment plan happening, like doing something about those disparities. So I think colorblindness, racial ideology is actually violent because of the impact it has on other people who do want to enter into conversations about race and racism. So it's not just this cute thing, like I don't see purple, green, or polka dots. It's not cute at all. It actually doesn't have that kind of impact.
Danielle.
I think it's been, oh, sorry, was Danny talking?
Okay.
Oh, okay. So, you know, it seems evident on its face, even like reading this book, but just, you know, being a human and reading in general as a psychiatrist, that the concept of colorblind is not an okay one. I've been curious in the last few weeks about something that keeps coming up for me clinically. So since we all are psychiatrists, I've been opening the door, if you will, which is something I've done, I'd say, for years, but I'd say more so checking in with my Black patients, like very explicitly. And I have had many of my elderly Black patients who, when I approach it with some humility, saying like, I understand I'm your white doctor and you might not want to talk to me about this, but I want you to know I'm here to listen. If you want to talk to me about how everything for the last several weeks / hundreds of years is impacting you right now. And I've had like not one, not two, like many of my 70-plus-year-old Black patients tell me, Dr. Gutman, I can talk to you about anything. I'm colorblind. You're just a human. I'm just a human. And then, you know, in my head, in my little like fragile white, progressive white head, I'm like, colorblind, don't say that. And then I'm like, okay, well, I'm not going to white explain not saying colorblind to my 75-year-old Black patient. So I'm in a bit of a bind here. I'm just going to listen. But it's been a funny thing that's made me wonder if there's also just, if it's a time and place concept that maybe will age out if we're lucky, that it it's a concept that might be for the 60 plus, 70 plus crowd. Just wondering other people's experience.
Alisa, are you saying, will colorblind, this concept phase out? I'm sorry, I missed the question.
What I'm asking is, I'm wondering, because I've had this said to me by many elderly Black patients. I'm just wondering if this is a civil rights concept that came, and maybe we'll see it age out. Like if that word, because I'm not, I think I've been confused by this experience of being told like, no, we're just humans. And I'm like, no, we're not. It's okay. We can talk about it. But I don't know if it's just a phrasing that came from the civil rights, and that's why some of my Black patients are using it in that age group.
I'd be curious if anyone took you up on the offer, and then curious about what you think about people who did not.
If anyone took me up on the offer to talk,
yeah.
I'd say most of my patients took me up on the offer to talk, if not all.
Despite the colorblind statement?
Yeah, despite saying that to me. That's an interesting question. I go, yeah, no, I'd say most, if not all, if I think back, of my patients wanted to talk to me about where they're at. And that statement didn't have much to do with it. Yeah.
I think it's like the way that I'm formulating it is that it's sort of like a, what is the word? Gratifying white comfort kind of statement. We don't have to talk about that. Like, I know you would, I mean, for me, if I said that, I know you would be uncomfortable. We're just two people sitting here having a conversation, which is obviously quite the opposite, especially for people who are like 60 or 70 who lived through, Jim Crow, like, real hardcore stuff. So the way that I heard it is that it was sort of appeasing, or just gratifying some anticipated discomfort that you might have as the white practitioner around the conversation.
So got it. So in terms of your thinking, it's coming out not based on age from their end, but based on the power dynamic, because I'm bringing up something, but I'm always in the power position as their doctor, that they're trying to minimize my discomfort.
You're white first, though. Like, I mean, I think the power dynamics of the doctor-patient relationship is there too. But anytime a white person opens up a conversation about race, like danger, alarm bells go off, despite having like an alliance and things of that nature. So I don't know. I just would wonder, I guess we would have to ask them, but what part of that was just like a socialized response in a conversation where a white person, like, ask about race.
Yeah, there's like a number of interpretations on the Facebook feed too, which is, like you're saying, trying to make you comfortable as their doctor, being socialized not to talk to white people about race, caretaking, doctor and a white woman. Those are all comments. Some stuff just disappeared and I can't see it, but there was like several other like kind of interpretations around that same kind of what you guys are talking about.
Jessica, I wanted to ask you, sorry, if you weren't finished, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Do you think, so you said that when a white person brings up race, it sets off alarm bells. Do you think that is like a learned anticipatory response to white fragility? Like, even if this person is coming to me as a quote unquote ally, I still can't say what I really think or say what I want to say because of white fragility itself?
I mean, I want to say yes, and because it's not just white fragility. So there was a video that came out yesterday. Lord, I saw this at like 8 o'clock at night as I'm with my like 2.5-year-old, of this man, I think, and his 2 children in a car, driving their own car, and there's a white woman in the street who believes that that's not his vehicle. So she stands in front of his car, tries to get him to explain to her why he's driving that car. Then she enlists the help of essentially white onlookers, and they become a white mob who are interrogating this man about driving this car. So it's not necessarily fragility, because again, that word doesn't quite speak to the danger of it. But I would say that's an example of a situation where if you don't appease whiteness, you might actually die. So it's more of like, that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about that you feel in your body when that conversation's opened up, that I don't think white fragility quite captures, though that's a part of it.
Yeah,
I think I've seen that video.
Yeah, I saw
where
that.
she's in the end, she's like, why are you trying to run me over? And he's just trying to exit the scene with his car, and she's now accusing him of trying to kill her. I think I've seen that video.
I mean, it's white aggression, right?
It's aggression.
Jessica, it's white aggression. It's not the white fragility that's concerning. It's white violence against Black bodies.
Right, and it's a survival tactic against, well, not saying Alisa, but just weaponization of privilege. So it's what you're doing to survive this situation. There are, and I can see how it's generational, but I can also see how it's regional. I can see how it's multifactorial, because I have some friends who are psychiatrists who are from the, even though I am in the South, I guess, who are in the real deep South and were raised in the South, who say like, well, you know, there's just a way that you say things, or there's just a way that you have to survive in the white South. And there are people who are older, even just this week, who are from an older generation than me, who say like, you know, Danny, there's just way to say things that's more palatable than the way that you're saying it. And so it's because that is learned survival. Like, that's how you survive. And not saying that, oh, I need to survive with Dr. Gutman, but this is just the way that my family has taught, not me, because my family were pretty radical activists over here, but you know, this is the way that I've learned in society that I have to survive. So I'm gonna comfort Dr. Gutman as, I mean, she's a nice white lady and she cares about me, and I want to continue to get treatment, so let me not make her upset. So
let me not provoke her.
Exactly, let me not provoke her, and suddenly there's some type of, not that you're guilty of this, but some type of weaponization of her privilege. Like, if we get into it, am I gonna get involuntarily committed? Am I going to be placed on Thorazine or something like that? So we have to realize that there's many implications and consequences to these interactions because of not just the physician-patient dynamic, but the white physician, Black patient dynamic.
Do you all have any thought on, I know I'm seeing that we probably have to move on, but just one more quick thought on this subject. What are everyone's thoughts here about the possibility then, if in this subject there is trying to, you know, appease the white physician, would that also then include minimizing symptoms or not being completely open with symptoms and what they've been going through, and also then in a way kind of derailing, or not them purposefully, but deterring treatment in a certain way because we can't truly have an open therapeutic rapport? Is that a very real possibility then?
I'm sure that happens all the time, right?
Exactly, right.
I mean, both in this context and in other contexts, but yeah.
Yeah, someone just to point out, they said it's a trauma response, and I think that is super important to acknowledge, because again, it is. And no matter how nice you are as a white person or a white adjacent person to a you know, Black person, it is what it is. Like, that trauma response is it's always gonna be there. And I think directly commenting on the potential dangers of entering into that conversation would be really important. Like, I recognize that, you know, talking about race and with a white person can be very dangerous, and you might not want to, and just giving people an out, because again, you do have the power in that dynamic to assert an out or not, and opening up the conversation feels like you're giving them power, but you're also forcing them into a corner to have it. So just some thoughts on how to approach that. It's complicated, but important to acknowledge the trauma response.
I think actually, like, a whole other discussion that we could have on, you know, specific issues in psychiatric care that we probably all should have gotten in residency, but like, I think I have to say, you know, like, my culture and psychiatry class was probably, like, covered none of this. So I think this would be a great discussion to have at like another point in more detail. We do only have about 5 minutes left, so you know, we got through probably, you know, 20% of our questions and discussion points for the book. And so we'll have to decide, what we want to do specifically, like regarding the content of the book, but also I just wanted to have each of us maybe go around and just any last statements, and also like if you have one succinct, like a one sentence point that you would like to have people take away from tonight, that would be great too. And here we'll go in the same circle as before. Why don't we start with Allison?
Start with me. I think the one thing that I took away from the book and that I'm taking away from this conversation tonight is that we have to be having these conversations, real conversations, not conversations that make ourselves feel as white people better, like we're doing something. We have to be having these uncomfortable conversations. And for me personally, my takeaway is that I have to continue developing my vocabulary to have these conversations so that I can approach a Black person and they will not be afraid. They will not feel like I'm a dangerous person. And I also need to develop a vocabulary to call out racism and racist behavior when it's happening, when I see it, in a way that's productive rather than an emotional or angry way. I think that's really important for me moving forward.
Thanks. How about you, Alisa?
Just for a simple takeaway, this is on me. I need to continue to do the work, and I need to be vocal and an upstander and call it out every time I see it, and use the social capital that I have as a white physician and spend that to make change.
Great, thank you. How about you, Jonathan?
Gosh, taking away one thought from a conversation that needs to continue for the rest of my life, right? I think as psychiatrists, we're very comfortable with unconscious biases, and we talk about them often, we think about them, and the biggest takeaway for me is that this is an unconscious bias that runs the world that we share. And whatever steps I can do to make that conscious, to make it discussed, and to do it in from a place of humility, are things that I want to practice moving forward.
So I guess well, I forgot what the questions were. A takeaway from this conversation. I'll say next step. I think a next step that I would personally like to see are people taking their bodies with their words. There's a lot of research out there about like the cortisol stress response that we have to interracial interactions that drives a lot of people, patients perceiving you as not being hip or with it or safe in these spaces, and every other space that you're in. And the only way to reduce that cortisol response for white people specifically is to be around Black people. So talk about being anti-racist all day long, but do you invite Black people into your home for dinner? Are you going out for happy hours with them? Do your kids have friends that look like me? All those are like the walking with your body sorts of things that are required for things to actually change. So both intellectual, but also expanding your interracial contact would be really important. I'd like to see more of that.
Wonderful. Danielle?
I'll say just something that I'm always saying. Black people are tired, and Black people include Black psychiatrists. I know sometimes you're like, oh, you're not really like black. Like we are. We're really black, and we are going through this trauma. We're going through this experience, and we're feeling it, and it's not up to us to fix this system. Like we didn't create this. We've been trying to survive in this. So it's really the time for others to do some introspection and to think about what you can do. Like, what can you do with your privilege? What can you do? Like the next time that someone makes a racist joke, what can you do instead of just being like, and brushing it off? Or what can you do the next time someone says something to one of your trainees or medical students and says, oh, calls them a racial slur or doesn't want them in the room? or prevents them from going into the ER or a secure area. Do something. Like we've talked about, Jessica knows that I don't like action papers. I only like actions. She writes wonderful ones, and I only want to see actions. I only want to see steps. I want to see real, tangible things that you can do that you've thought about. Now, everyone doesn't have to be outside protesting, but what are you going to do the next time someone says, "Okay, protest, but don't loot"? What can you do about that? Next steps.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. Mona?
Sure. My takeaway in my journey, and continues to be my journey in my own culture's anti-Black racism, which is expect and accept discomfort in having these conversations. If we have the expectation and we can accept it, we can sit, we can work through. And so we don't avoid. Be consistent past all this. Don't do things with trends. Trends are what is going to end us, and is going to, we live in a time of trends, and that can't be this work. This work requires consistency. And finally, I say to myself first, but for others out there that might this might resonate with, beware of performative allyship, where you are looking for gratitude and acceptance by the people that you are saying you support, instead of doing it because it will change you and it will change the world. And there is something so much more than likes and acceptance and all of this stuff. So beware of that, and beware of your own disappointment and anger when you don't get gratitude or don't get acknowledgement for your allyship. So I'll just leave that as our next steps. Do something because it's meaningful. It will change you. It will change you. And so do it for you.
Thank you. Thank you. Really, thank you to everybody. Like my personal next steps and takeaways are maybe a little bit more simple. Like I really, if you guys, because I've heard, again, like I'm going to say I've heard about this book for 2 years. I did not open it or touch it or look at it until the last 2 weeks. And so if you just have even an inkling of like, this kind of piqued my interest, just download the Kindle or the ebook or whatever. It's like $10-15, and just start going through it. It'll just start there. And then general next steps for us, I think I would like to have more. I'll say I both learned a lot in the last 2 weeks in preparing for this. And then even during just the last hour and a half, I learned a lot. So I thank you guys for that. And so I'd like to do more of these in the near future. It doesn't necessarily have to be with the same people every time, because I don't want to burden anybody too much. And I think it'll be helpful for people to participate who haven't done it before, So I'll just keep an eye out for posts on that in the near future. And thanks, you guys. Have a good night, and we'll see you guys. We'll see you guys soon. Okay, take care. Bye.
Good night.